The US Navy spent millions building warships, but this man saved the Pacific Fleet using something he found in his kitchen, a handful of wooden matches. The 4th of June, 1942, the Battle of Midway. Commander John Thach grips the stick of his F-4F Wildcat, staring directly into a nightmare. He is leading just 4 slow, clunky American fighters against a swarm of 20 lethal Japanese Zeros. By every metric of aviation, Thach is already a dead man. The Zero is faster, it turns tighter, it climbs higher. It was the Invincible monster that had slaughtered Allied pilots across the Pacific for 6 months straight. But Thach wasn't relying on speed, or armor, or even firepower to survive this suicide mission. He was betting his life, and the lives of his men, on a desperate experiment he invented just weeks earlier, using a handful of wooden matches on his kitchen table. How did a piece of dinnerware logic defeat the most advanced fighter plane of World War II? To understand why Thach's plan was considered suicidal, you have to understand the monster he was facing. In early 1942, the Japanese Mitsubishi Zero wasn't just a plane, it was a phantom. It had a kill ratio that terrified Allied intelligence. The Zero was lighter, faster, and could turn on a dime. American pilots were actually given a strict, humiliating order: never dogfight a Zero. If you tried to turn with one, you died. It was that simple. In contrast, Thach's plane, the F-4F Wildcat, was a flying brick. It was heavy, sluggish, and climbed like a dump truck compared to the Ferrari-like Zero. In a one-on-one fight, the math was absolute. The American pilot loses 100% of the time. But John Thach refused to accept that technology was the only variable. While the Navy scrambled to build better machines, Thach sat alone in his quarters, obsessing over a geometry problem. He realized that if he played by the old rules of air combat, his men were doomed. So, he decided to break the rules. He was about to prove that a bad plane, flown with a brilliant mind, could trap and kill the perfect machine. By early 1942, the Japanese Navy wasn't just winning, they were dominating. And the tip of their spear was the Mitsubishi A6M0. To the American pilots stationed in the Pacific, this plane felt like it defied the laws of physics. Let's look at the data, because the numbers are terrifying. The Zero was significantly lighter than the American F-4F Wildcat. We're talking a difference of over 2,000 pounds. This weight advantage allowed the Zero to climb faster and, most importantly, turn tighter. In a classic dogfight, where 2 planes circle each other trying to get on the other's tail, the Zero would win every single time. It could spin inside the Wildcat's turn radius and be sitting on the American pilot's 6 o'clock before he even knew what happened. Then there was the Wildcat. The American pilots loved to joke that the F-4F stood for failure times 4. It was rugged, sure. It had armor plating and self-sealing fuel tanks that the fragile Zero lacked. It could take a beating. But in aerial combat, taking a beating isn't a strategy, it's just a slower way to die. The tactical doctrine of the US Navy at the time was outdated. They were still teaching pilots to fly in 3-plane formations and engage in one-on-one turning fights. This was suicide. Reports coming in from China and the early Pacific battles painted a grim picture. The Zero was untouchable. The morale among US squadrons was plummeting. They felt like they were being sent up in slow, heavy coffins to fight against nimble samurai swords. The situation was desperate. The US military machine couldn't just snap its fingers and produce a new, better fighter plane overnight. That would take years. But the war was happening now. The pilots on the carriers didn't need a new plane in 1943. They needed a way to survive tomorrow morning. The defining problem wasn't just technology, it was geometry. How do you fight an enemy that can physically outmaneuver you in every direction? The experts said it was impossible. The math said it was impossible. The terrifying kill counts from the early battles confirmed it was impossible. The entire US Navy was paralyzed by the technical superiority of the Zero. They were waiting for better technology to save them. But one man, a quiet, analytical squadron commander named John Thach, decided to stop waiting for new planes. He believed the answer wasn't in the engineering, but in the mind. And late one night, alone in his kitchen, he sat down not with flight manuals or blueprints, but with a simple box of wooden matches. What he built on that table would change the history of aerial warfare forever. John S. Jimmy Thach wasn't your typical Hollywood fighter ace. He wasn't reckless, and he didn't fly by the seat of his pants. He was a calculator in a cockpit, a gunnery expert who treated aerial combat not as a duel, but as a physics problem. But beneath that calm exterior, Thach was a man possessed. He had read the classified intelligence reports on the Zero, and the data gave him nightmares. He knew that the standard US Navy doctrine fighting in a three-plane V formation was a death sentence. It was too rigid. It left the leader vulnerable and the wingmen useless. Thach knew that if he led his men into battle using the Navy's official playbook, he would be writing condolence letters to their mothers by the end of the week. He later said, "It gives you a sinking feeling in your stomach to know you're going out to fight someone who is superior to you." So, Thach did something unheard of. He brought his work home. Night after night, while the rest of the world slept, Thach sat at his kitchen table with a handful of wooden matches. Each matchstick represented a plane. He would push them across the table, simulating the speeds and turning radiuses of the Zero versus the Wildcat. He realized he couldn't outturn the Zero. So, he stopped trying to chase the enemy. Instead, he devised a plan to let the enemy chase him. He realized that two planes working in perfect synchronization were infinitely more dangerous than three planes flying in a rigid line. He broke the formation down to a simple pair. When a Zero attacked one Wildcat from behind, that Wildcat wouldn't run away. Instead, it would turn across the path of its wingman. This dragged the enemy Zero directly into the gun sights of the second Wildcat. It was a beam defense position. One pilot plays the bait, the other plays the executioner. It was simple, brilliant, and totally contradictory to everything naval aviators had been taught. Thach was convinced the geometry worked on his kitchen table, but would it work in the sky? He took the idea to Ensign Edward Butch O'Hare, a man who would later become a legend in his own right. Thach told O'Hare to fly his Wildcat like a Zero-use, full throttle, dive fast, and attack without mercy. Thach and another pilot would fly the Weave at reduced power to simulate their disadvantage. They went up. O'Hare attacked. He came in for the kill on the bait plane, but every single time he tried to lock on, he looked up to find the second Wildcat pointing its nose directly at his cockpit. O'Hare landed, shaken and impressed. He told Thach, "Skipper, it works. I couldn't make an attack without getting shot." They had a theory. They had a successful practice run. They had a few wooden matches that said they could win. But a mock dogfight over safe waters is very different from the chaos of total war. Thach had proven his geometry against a friend. Now, fate was about to call his bluff. Thach received his orders to deploy to the USS Yorktown. The destination was a small atoll called Midway. And waiting for him wasn't a friendly test pilot, it was the elite killer squadron of the Imperial Japanese Navy. Thach was about to gamble his life and the entire US Pacific Fleet on a maneuver that had never been used in actual combat. If his math was wrong by even a fraction of a second, his squadron wouldn't just lose the fight. They would be erased from the sky. On the morning of the 4th of June 1942, John Thach wasn't just flying a patrol. He was assigned the most dangerous job in the Navy, escort duty for the torpedo squadron. He was protecting a group of TBD devastators. If the Wildcat was a flying brick, the Devastator was a flying coffin. They were slow, obsolete, and had to fly low and straight to drop their torpedoes. They were sitting ducks. Thach's job was to be the shield, but the numbers were catastrophic. Thach launched from the USS Yorktown with a division of only 4 Wildcats. As they climbed to altitude, they looked down and saw the Japanese fleet, but before they could even process the sight, the sky began to rain fire. Radar wasn't saving them today. A swarm of 15 to 20 Japanese Zeros descended from the clouds like angry hornets. The ratio was 5-1, and these weren't rookie pilots. These were the aces of the Imperial Navy, men who had never lost a dogfight. The Zeros immediately did what they did best. They used their superior speed to swarm the Americans. Within seconds, one of Thach's Wildcats was shot to pieces and vanished into the ocean. Now it was 3 against 20. The Japanese pilots knew the American playbook. They expected the Wildcats to panic. They expected them to break formation, try to turn, and inevitably stall out. The Zero pilots began their wolf pack tactics. They would single out a Wildcat, get on its tail, and shred it with 20mm cannons. Thach found himself in a desperate situation. His radio was crackling with chaos. He looked over his shoulder. A Zero was locked onto his wingman, Ensign R.A.M. Dib. Another Zero was locking onto Thach. This is the moment where training usually collapses and instinct takes over. The instinct is to run. The instinct is to pull back on the stick and pray you can turn tighter than the enemy. But Thach knew the data. He knew the turn radius of a Zero was tighter than a Wildcat. If he turned away, he died. If he flew straight, he died. Ensign Dib screamed over the radio, "Skipper, there's a Zero on my tail. Get him off me!" The Japanese pilot behind Dib had his finger on the trigger. He was seconds away from a kill. He was flying the superior machine. He had the superior position. Mathematically, the fight was over. But Thach didn't tell Dib to break away. He didn't tell him to dive. Thach barked a command that made zero sense in the history of aviation warfare. He shouted, "Turn toward me!" At the exact same moment, Thach turned toward Dib. To the Japanese pilots, this looked like madness. The two American planes were flying on a collision course with each other. It looked like a suicide pact. The Zero pilot chasing Dib was fixated on his target. He saw Dib turn, so he turned with him, easily cutting inside the arc, lining up his sights for the kill. He thought the American had just made a fatal mistake, but he was wrong. By turning inward, Thach and Dib had created a scissoring flight path. As they crossed paths, the geometry changed instantly. Thach flew right under his wingman, and as he looked up, there it was. The belly of the Japanese Zero that was chasing Dib. The enemy pilot had been so focused on the bait, Dib, he had flown directly into the firing line of the hook, Thach. Thach didn't have to outturn the Zero. He just had to be in the right place when the Zero flew past. Thach squeezed the trigger. 6 .50 caliber machine guns roared to life. The Zero, caught completely by surprise from a side angle, disintegrated. It happened again. Another Zero latched onto Thach. Thach called the turn. They weaved. The Zero followed the bait, and Dib blew him out of the sky. The Thach weave wasn't a defensive maneuver. It was an offensive trap disguised as a retreat. In that single engagement, facing 20 enemy aircraft, Thach's tiny unit shot down at least 3 Zeros, some reports say more, and drove the rest away. They held the line. The Japanese pilots returned to their carriers in shock. For the first time in the war, the Invincible Zero had been beaten not by a faster engine, but by a smarter idea. The prey had become the predator. The spell of the Zero was broken, not by a new engine, but by a new thought. History is often written by the victors, but it's usually defined by the innovators, the ones like Thach, who refuse to accept the odds. We uncover these stories because they remind us that even in the darkest hour, human ingenuity is the ultimate weapon. But the Pacific theater is vast, and many of these stories remain buried under the waves. I want to turn this over to you, our community of historians. Do you know of another specific moment in World War II where a weaker force used a brilliant, unconventional tactic to defeat a superior enemy? Maybe it's a tank commander in North Africa, or a lone sniper in Stalingrad who broke the rules to survive. Drop your story in the comments below. We read them all, and your knowledge helps us decide which forgotten hero to honor in our next video. Let's keep these histories alive, together. The miracle at Midway wasn't just that the US won, it was how they won. When Thach landed back on the carrier, his plane was riddled with holes, but his theory was bulletproof. The WWII hadn't just saved his life, it had shattered the myth of the Zero's invincibility. But Thach knew that one battle doesn't win a war. The data coming in from the rest of the Pacific was still grim. While Thach's specific squadron had success, other squadrons using the old V formation were still being slaughtered. The Navy was bleeding pilots faster than they could train them. Thach didn't hoard his secret. He immediately began a campaign to re-educate the entire US Navy. He pushed for the permanent abandonment of the three-plane formation, arguing with data and diagrams that a two-plane mutual support unit was the only way to survive modern air combat. He was fighting tradition, ego, and decades of military dogma. But the numbers from Midway were undeniable. The WWII became standard operating procedure. By 1943, the industrial might of the United States finally kicked into high gear. Enter the Grumman F-6F Hellcat. If the Wildcat was a scrappy underdog, the Hellcat was a predator. And here is the crucial data point. The Hellcat was designed with direct input from combat pilots like Thach. It was faster than the Zero. It had more armor. It carried more ammunition. But here is the fascinating twist. Even with a superior plane, the Navy did not abandon the WWII. They realized that Thach's geometry wasn't a crutch for a bad plane. It was a force multiplier for a good one. When American pilots flew the superior Hellcat using Thach's superior tactics, the result wasn't a fight, it was a massacre. The kill ratio of the Hellcat in the Pacific Theater rose to an astronomical 19-1. For every one Hellcat lost, 19 Japanese planes were shot down. Thach had turned the tables so completely that the hunters had become the hunted. But just as the US gained air superiority, the war changed again. By 1944, desperation forced Japan to alter their strategy. They stopped trying to dogfight. They stopped trying to return home. Enter the kamikaze. Thach, now an operations officer, watched in horror as Japanese planes ignored the American fighters entirely. They weren't trying to shoot down the Wildcats or Hellcats. They were turning themselves into human-guided missiles aimed directly at the US aircraft carriers. The WWII was designed for a dogfight. But how do you dogfight an enemy who wants to die? How do you weave against a missile? The data showed that traditional interception methods were failing. If a kamikaze got through the fighter screen, hundreds of sailors died. Thach was faced with a new, impossible math problem. The enemy was no longer playing chess. They were playing Russian roulette. Thach went back to his mental drawing board. He realized that waiting to intercept the enemy near the fleet was too late. He proposed a new, radical concept. The big blue blanket. Instead of keeping fighters close to the carriers for defense, Thach proposed flooding the sky with constant, round-the-clock combat air patrols stationed 50 miles away from the fleet. He integrated radar technology to direct these patrols, creating a net that would catch the kamikazes before they could even see the US ships. It required 24-hour operations. It required precise coordination between radar operators on ships and pilots in the sky. It was exhausting. It was complex, but, just like the WWII, it was based on cold, hard logic. In the final months of the war, Thach's big blue blanket system intercepted hundreds of kamikazes. The sensory experience of the sailors on the decks changed from the terrifying scream of diving engines to the distant, muffled thuds of enemy planes exploding miles away, far from their targets. John Thach proved, once and for all, that warfare isn't just about who has the bigger gun or the faster engine. It is about the mind. He started with a matchstick on a kitchen table to save his friends, and he ended the war having built a shield that saved the entire fleet. He didn't just break the rules, he rewrote the physics of survival. The war ended in 1945, but the WWII did not. Most wartime improvisations are discarded once technology improves. We don't use trench warfare anymore. we don't use wooden battleships. But the concept John Thach invented on his kitchen table became immortal. As aviation moved into the jet age, planes became faster than sound. Missiles replaced machine guns. Yet, the fundamental truth Thach discovered remained absolute. A lone pilot is vulnerable. A pair of pilots is a weapon. The WWII evolved. It became the foundation of mutual support doctrine. In the skies over Vietnam, American F-4 Phantoms used variations of Thach's geometry to survive against agile MiG fighters. Today, if you open a modern fighter combat manual, the DNA of John Thach is still there. He proved that tactics over technology isn't just a slogan, it is the only way an underdog survives. John Thach didn't fade away after Midway. He rose to the rank of 4-star admiral. He was celebrated as the man who cracked the code of the Zero and the man who built the shield against the kamikaze. He is remembered by military historians not as a reckless cowboy, but as the supreme tactician. He was the quiet engineer of victory. He showed the world that the most dangerous weapon in the US arsenal wasn't the atomic bomb or the aircraft carrier. It was the ability to adapt, to look at a hopeless situation, admit your weakness, and calculate a new path to survival. It is a perfect hero's journey. The man who used matchsticks to save the world. But history is rarely a clean fairy tale. There is a haunting footnote to the legend of the WWII. Remember Butch O'Hare? The first man to believe in Thach? The man who flew the Zero roll in those first terrifying test flights? The man who looked Thach in the eye and said, "Skipper, it works." Butch O'Hare became a legend in his own right. Chicago's O'Hare Airport is named after him. But while Thach rose to admiral and lived to see his tactics change the world, O'Hare did not. In November 1943, during a chaotic night mission to intercept Japanese bombers using a variation of the very team tactics, Thach helped pioneer Butch O'Hare vanished. He was shot down in the dark, likely by friendly fire or a lucky shot from a Japanese gunner. He was never found. The irony is cruel. Thach designed a maneuver specifically to save the lives of his pilots. He designed it to ensure that no wingman was ever left alone and unprotected. And it worked. It saved thousands of American lives. It brought fathers home to their children. But it couldn't save the first man who trusted him. John Thach lived the rest of his life with the accolades of a hero, but he carried the silent burden of every commander. He knew that geometry is perfect on a kitchen table, but in the chaos of war, even the perfect plan cannot stop a stray bullet. The WWII was invincible. The men flying it were not. It all comes back to those wooden matches on a kitchen table. Think about the absurdity of it. In an era of industrial warfare, where success was measured in horsepower, tonnage, and caliber, the most lethal weapon in the Pacific Theater wasn't forged in a factory. It was invented by a desperate man moving sticks across a tablecloth. Those matches represented 1,940 seconds technology, fragile, flammable, and expendable. But John Thach saw them differently. He realized that while a single match snaps easily, a bundle is unbreakable. He took a plane that was statistically doomed, the Wildcat, and turned its greatest weakness into a trap. The numbers tell the final story. Before the WWII, engaging a Zero was considered suicide. By the end of the war, thanks to Thach's tactics and the eventual arrival of the Hellcat, the US Navy achieved a kill ratio of 19-1. That is not just a victory, that is a statistical anomaly. It is what happens when you stop playing the enemy's game and invent a new one. This brings us to the great paradox of John Thach. He was a warrior who didn't rely on aggression, but on geometry. He was a sky Ronin who didn't seek personal glory, but sought collective survival. He proved that the underdog status is often a mindset, not a reality. The Zero was superior in every technical specification, but it lacked one thing: the capacity to adapt to a changing battlefield. The Japanese doctrine relied on the perfection of the machine and the individual skill of the samurai. Thatch relied on the imperfection of his machine and the collective strength of the team. Today, aviation technology has advanced beyond John Thatch's wildest dreams. We have stealth fighters that can engage enemies they never see. We have missiles that travel at Mach 4. Yet, every modern fighter pilot, from Top Gun instructors to rookies in F-35 seconds, still learns the concepts of mutual support and the WWII. The planes change, the speeds change, the technology changes, but the lesson remains eternal. When you are outgunned, outpaced, and outclassed. When the data says you have zero chance of survival, you don't need a faster engine. You need a faster mind. John Thatch is gone. The Wildcats are in museums. But look up. Somewhere in the sky right now, 2 fighter jets are crossing paths, weaving an invisible pattern in the air. The Thatch weave is still flying. If this story of John Thatch, a man who used a handful of matchsticks to defeat the most feared machine in the Pacific, resonated with you, if you felt that moment of tension when the trap finally snapped shut, then I have a small request. Please hit that like button. It's not just vanity metric for us. Think of the YouTube algorithm as a modern battlefield of attention. When you like this video, you are sending a signal to the system that history matters. You are helping to rescue the memory of Butch O'Hare, John Thatch, and the Wildcat pilots from the bottom of the digital ocean. Your engagement literally helps push this story in front of someone else who needs to hear it. It is a small digital gesture that honors a massive real-world sacrifice. And before you go, I want to hear from you in the comments. Thatch proved that human creativity could beat superior engineering. As we move into an era of AI, drones, and automated warfare, do you think the human factor will always be the deciding factor? Or is the era of the Sky Ronin finally over? Let me know your thoughts down below. If you want to uncover more forgotten battles and the brilliant minds that won them, make sure you are subscribed and have that notification bell turned on. Join our squadron. Let's keep history flying. We tell these stories not to glorify war, but to honor the human spirit within it. The history of conflict is often reduced to maps, dates, and casualty lists, but as we've seen today, history is actually made by individuals, by people like John Thatch, who refused to give up when the odds were impossible. Our mission here is simple: to dig up these forgotten moments, to wipe away the dust, and to ensure that the brilliance and sacrifice of the past are never lost to the silence of time. And we cannot do this alone. This channel exists because of you. Every time you watch, every time you share these stories, and every time you engage in the comments, you are doing more than just consuming content. You are keeping these memories alive. You are the co-authors of this digital archive. You are the reason the legacy of the WWII and the bravery of the Wildcat pilots will continue to echo for another generation. So, the next time you find yourself facing an impossible problem, the next time you feel outgunned, outpaced, or overwhelmed, remember John Thatch. Remember the quiet of a kitchen table late at night, and remember that sometimes all it takes to change the world is a single matchstick and the courage to strike it. Thank you for being part of this journey. We will see you in the skies.